President Trump's ex-personal attorney, Michael Cohen, who has said in the past that he would take a bullet for Trump, has reorganized his priorities. In an interview with ABC News Saturday, Cohen said sent a signal that if pressed, he would cooperate with investigators. Here it is, quote, "My wife, my daughter, and my son have my first loyalty and always will. I put family and country first." Cohen said, "Once I understand what charges might be filed against me, if any at all, I will defer to my new counsel for guidance." Asked how he might respond if Trump's legal team tries to discredit him, Cohen's voice gained strength. Quote, "I will not be a punching bag as part of anyone's defense strategy. I am not a villain of this story, and I will not allow others to try and depict me that way." Cohen also said the Mueller investigation should not be called a witch hunt. That's disagreeing with President Trump. He repudiated Russia's attempt to interfere in the election and said simply accepting the denial of Mr. Putin is unsustainable. Jeremy Peters, it seems Michael Cohen has found his voice.
It does. This was always one of the more peculiar storylines, but one that was bound to erupt because, as we all know, Trump loves his petty torments. He loves to humiliate people. We've seen this with Jeff Sessions. We've seen this with Rex Tillerson. I mean, these are cabinet officials. And the humiliation that Cohen was subject to over the years, not just that, but the fact that he, from what I'm told, has a wife who is not very fond of Donald Trump and certainly can't be very happy with the way that he's being treated. This probably was only just a matter of time. We'll have to wait to see what happens.
Casey, what do you think? I mean, I would think actually it would be nice if some Republicans felt a little bit more concerned about their reputations, because at some point this presidency ends, but their political careers, if they want them, what do they do?
Well, I think their political careers may still be brighter regardless than Michael Cohen seems to be in the face of Robert Mueller, quite frankly. And I think the sense it seems to me is that he's finally getting some very high quality legal advice. Clearly, this interview, which took place off camera, was a very specific step in a certain direction. It had to have been designed to send a signal. One of the other things that ABC News is reporting is that there was an agreement previously between Michael Cohen's attorneys and attorneys for the president about sharing information. That's going to get torn up now. And that, I think, sends a real concrete signal here. Now, of course, the question is, don't forget, Michael Cohen was intimately involved in the discussions around a Trump Tower Moscow. So I'm also curious, his comments about the Russia investigation not being a hoax, not saying that they meddled, being unsustainable. What does he know? What does he have? How is he involved directly in Trump campaign ties to Moscow?
Yeah, good question.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.